So the basic question is, how significant is the risk of a major nuclear war? And the unfortunate answer, or maybe the fortunate answer, as we'll see, is that it's much greater than society realizes. And in this brief talk, I'm going to explain why a child born today probably has worse than even odds of surviving his or her natural life. And by the way, that's an estimate with which former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry agrees and gave me permission to quote him. So it's not just me who says this. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy estimated that the risk of war had been somewhere between 1 and 3 and even. In his mind, therefore, the Cuban Missile Crisis was equivalent to playing a global version of Russian roulette with a 2 or 3 chambered revolver, a deadly game that I call nuclear roulette. Now, most conventional wars have a much smaller risk, but it doesn't matter whether the gun has 2 chambers, 6 chambers, or 600. If you keep pulling the trigger indefinitely, it's not a question of if you'll die, it's only a question of when. It's inevitable. And that's why a paper I published over 40 years ago was titled On the Inevitability and Prevention of Nuclear War. We'll return to the prevention part briefly in a few minutes. But let's look at the reasons why the Cuban Missile Crisis was so dangerous, even more so than Kennedy realized when he estimated that the risk was somewhere between 1 and 3 and even. Neither Kennedy nor any of his advisors knew that 3 Soviet submarines that were attacked by American destroyers near the quarantine line carried nuclear torpedoes. They did. And in at least one case, the crew has alleged that the captain gave orders to arm the nuclear torpedo, probably to use it. Let's see. Fortunately, he was talked down by another officer who was on board the submarine, a man who is sometimes called the man who saved the world. So that's just one example. Now, why would a captain give such a dangerous order? I mean, that's ridiculous. I mean, use the nuclear torpedo? Well, the last he'd heard when he was in radio contact on the surface was that World War III seemed imminent, and he was being attacked, and there was a lot of damage to his submarine. So this isn't just a minor situation. Furthermore, temperatures on the submarine had reached 55 degrees Celsius, 130 degrees Fahrenheit, because the air conditioning was the Soviet air conditioning that was designed for the Arctic and had broken down. It was not designed for the Caribbean. And sailors were fainting from lack of oxygen because the submarine was a diesel electric, which was not supposed to be submerged so long. Another factor which made the Cuban Missile Crisis very dangerous was the fact that the Soviets had tactical nuclear weapons on Cuba to repel an American invasion. And yet, President Kennedy, his advisors, and even after the crisis was resolved, the Joint Chiefs of Staff wanted to use an invasion of Cuba to excise the communist cancer from the Western Hemisphere once and for all. None of them contemplated, none of them thought that the Soviets might have battlefield nuclear weapons on Cuba, which in fact they did. There are a number of other factors which made the Cuban Missile Crisis extremely dangerous, but there's not time to treat them in this talk. Rather, let's turn to today. One would hope that we learned our lesson, and today we're behaving much more rationally. Unfortunately, we're not. During the Pristina airport crisis of 1999, a British 3-star was ordered by an American 4-star general to take actions which he said, "Sir, I'm not going to start World War III for you." I don't have time to go into the details, but that was a very dangerous situation. And the current war in Ukraine is extremely dangerous. Early in that war, President Biden told his national security advisor that, quote, "If we succeed in ejecting Russia from Ukraine, we face a very strong likelihood of nuclear use." And yet Biden proceeded with continuing the Ukrainian war. This does not justify Putin's invasion of Russia, but it says that we have not been blameless either. And by the way, the Ukrainian public thinks that as well, which I don't have time to go into. So, as with the Cuban Missile Crisis, there are also a number of other nuclear near misses which show that we have not learned how to behave in the nuclear era. We're continuing to play nuclear roulette and will inevitably destroy civilization unless we stop and put down the gun, which leads to how we can prevent what is currently inevitable. Many see putting down the gun as nuclear disarmament, but that's not going to solve the problem. If all that happened in the current world environment was we got rid of all the nuclear weapons, what would we do? The countries that knew how to build them would engage in a furious race to reconstitute their arsenals, and whoever got there first might well use them while it temporarily enjoyed a nuclear monopoly. So we need to think in terms of a process which makes what is currently impossible possible. I'll explain and I'll end in just a minute. The way to avoid a nuclear war is to avoid conventional wars that might escalate. And the way to avoid conventional wars is to avoid crises. Continuing down that path, we need to nip incipient crises in the bud. And I won't go into it, but this is how I became aware of Ukraine as a potential flashpoint years before the Soviet invasion. Now, for ages, humanity has dreamed of a more peaceful, more cooperative world, but thought itself incapable of achieving that goal. Today, we will either build that world or destroy ourselves. And the Einstein-Russell Manifesto put that very well. So let me stop there. I have a few other thoughts, but I'm not going to include them. I think this covers it.
Thank you very much. One thing I learned at the Chicago meeting was that there were been over, in addition to these crisis events that almost led to global war, 1,000 accidents and near misses and mistaken radar something. It is truly scary, but here is a short list of 6 actions that could be taken. They're realistic and reasonable and not as idealistic as Martin's dream, which was just enunciated. Brian.
All right, so if we could have a slide up while that happens. So as just a little preface is that 2 years ago, David said this was weighing heavily on his mind and challenged me to just have a chat with the students at Lindau, 600 of them, about what they saw as the danger of nuclear war. And he asserted to me that they were not thinking about it at all. I grew up in Montana, so I had Minutemen silos in my backyard where I grew up, and I thought about it a lot. And I did the test and was quickly convinced that people assumed, well, it hasn't happened for 80 years, so why would it happen now? And so I was convinced that it's something we need to bring to the fore because, as indicated, after decreasing risk for a while, we seem to be on the path of increasing risk. So we wanted to come up with some things that we could talk to governments of the world about that are lowering the risk right now that we saw as achievable, pragmatic. So the first is that nations should reiterate their commitment to a moratorium on nuclear explosive testing. That is something I did not think was in risk until, 6 months ago. And it does appear to be, even that is on the table. So we have not yet actually fully brought into force the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. I think 143 nations have signed, but not all that are required to have. And we encourage people to continue to work on that. Russia and the United States need to re-enter into successor treaty to the SALT treaty that David has indicated is coming out of its date this week, the last one between the two countries. After that, there was no commitment by either side not to start increasing the production of nuclear weapons again. China needs to enter discussions about their rapidly expanding arsenal. So a key feature of nuclear weapon deployment has been a clear articulation internationally in intent. And China has not done that. So people are guessing, and when they guess, bad things can happen. It increases the risks. In the age of AI, we have a new world where AI will be incorporated into defense and reactions. And we need to ensure and have nuclear-armed nations commit to effective human control, because accidents happen. And we need human control with at least two people making decisions. The United States, for example, does not adhere to the two-person rule right now. And we really need to have nuclear-armed nations adhere to these principles. China and Russia and the United States need to understand and be prepared to describe the relationship between offensive and defensive capabilities. If you build a golden dome, it is possible to counter it by just making new weapons and dummies, and it is mathematically pretty easily shown that it is much easier to defeat a golden dome type thing than to actually build it to make sure it is effective. So that is a conversation that needs to be had amongst the experts in the public. We need, and this seems like maybe the easiest thing to do, to create and expand secure communications between the nuclear-armed states. We talk about the red phone. There is no red phone to China. The red phone between the U.S. and Russia is not what it used to be. The communications between, for example, North Korea and other powered states, these are things where having dedicated comms channels, so things can be de-escalated, especially in times of uncertainty. This strikes us as being sort of the easiest thing to do and do quickly. Finally, every nation should once again publicly go through and recommit to the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons Treaty, the most powerful treaty that is in force, including holding their allies to account against that treaty. There is going to be huge pressure for new nuclear nations to emerge in the next 5 to 10 years, and the Non-Proliferation Treaty is the single thing we have against that. And what can people here in this room or listening do? Well, politicians ultimately respond to their public. And this is not an issue right now. It was an issue in the 50s and 60s. And governments around the world listened to their populations because they said it was important. If we can elevate this, if people genuinely think this is a risk that they would like to have lowered, then we should elevate it to our politicians in nations around the world. And it doesn't matter if it's Russia, China, the United States, or Australia. All nations need to see this as an important thing. I'll stop there.
What can we do? Well, as Brian said, at Lindau, we had the opportunity to talk to dozens of young physicists, 700, many opportunities, and each time I would ask them, what are the things you care about? What worries you? What are your concerns about the world? Number one, of course, climate. Climate, tenure, inflation, gender discrimination. Not one in any of these occasions ever mentioned nuclear war. Nuclear power plants, tsunamis coming into Germany, who knows? Nuclear war, nuclear weapon. And then when asked about their knowledge of what a megaton of nuclear weapons means, how many nuclear weapons there are, how long an American president has until he pushes the button, so 20 minutes, they knew nothing. Our younger generation, our students, if you find out, talk to them, know nothing. And they're physicists, they should. And we should educate them and continue to bring it up before them. We are their role models. And of course, if we have the opportunity, and some of us do because of these prizes, to talk to world leaders, although not in this setting, obviously. They're not interested in coming. But when we have the opportunity, we must remind them of the danger. And believe me, those countries which have nuclear weapons know very well the danger. They know it exactly, and they're terrified. And they do everything possible to make sure that their populations are not terrified. Because if those populations were terrified, then like in the 1960s and in the 1980s, they would go into the streets and demand that their governments reduce the probability that their grandchildren will not live out a full life.